Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Historical USA. Here, we discover the people and places and events that made America. Now, in this episode, we are going to be reacting to Bill O'Reilly's 5 Best Presidents list. If you haven't checked out my reaction to Bill O'Reilly's Worst Presidents list, I encourage you to go over there and watch that first before you watch this one, because we're going to probably reference that one a lot. So just FYI, I'll put it up in the corner here somewhere. So go check that out first. Come back. Just some housekeeping. I realized I didn't put my list for top 5 worst presidents, and I know some of you have asked. That's because I don't do top 5, 5 best, top 5 worst when it comes to presidents, and I don't think a lot of historians would. However, I could do a tier system, because I do think that certain presidents rank in a tier rather than, okay, that guy's the worst, when there's so many guys that are probably the worst, or there's so many presidents that were the best, and there's so many different ways you can evaluate that. So for me personally, if you want to see me do a tier list where I rate the president, let me know in the comments. I'm really excited today because I am not the only historian reacting to this list. We have a great content creator, has a wonderful channel here on YouTube, is a good friend of mine. I've been on her channel a few times, Jenn with Walk with History and Talk with History. Jenn, go ahead and introduce yourself to my viewers and where they can find you and follow you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenn. I am the host of Walk with History and the co-host of Talk with History. My husband hosts that show. But I'm a Navy veteran, former Navy pilot. Went back to school, got a master's degree of history with the GI Bill, and started Walk with History. As we move, it gave me something to do with my degree and all the locations we moved to. So I take you to the location and tell you the history. And then Talk with History is just more in depth to those episodes. Plus, we interview other historians, including Lisa, and we just give you tips and tricks to visit, where to park, what to see, where to eat, things along that nature, and more in-depth stories that I couldn't get to tell on the videos. But you can find me at Walk with History on YouTube. You can find Talk with History podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook.
Awesome. And I will link all of your links down in the description below. Go give Jenn over at Walk with History a follow and a subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and you give this video a thumbs up. And also leave your comments down below. This is going to be I think it's a pretty, let me say, an uneven list. So I'm interested to see what you guys have to say in the comments below. So don't hesitate to leave a comment. I would love to know your thoughts. So let's get on into this and see what Bill O'Reilly has to say and where he would rank some of the best presidents.
It's fun to dunk on the losers, but this country wouldn't be the greatest place on earth if all of its leaders were corrupt or cowardly, or both. So let's flip the script and kick off the countdown of Bill O'Reilly's best presidents ever, starting with a man who stood tall in times of crisis, even though he couldn't walk. Number 5 is Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
He saved the country during the Great Depression with the New Deal. It included Social Security, unemployment insurance, and public works projects. Then FDR saved the world in World War II. All right, so we start with Bill O'Reilly's 5th best president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Right, flawed man.
Had affairs.
Yeah, but I don't mind. So Franklin Roosevelt wanted to be a dictator. He didn't want Congress at all. He didn't want Supreme Court. He didn't want any of
Stacked
that.
the Supreme Court, right?
Right. He tried to. Failed. They cut him down, but he wanted to be a dictator.
For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
But anyway, Roosevelt had two enormous challenges, the Great Depression and World War II. And he handled both of them in a very methodical, courageous way, and he was successful. more so in World War II than in the Depression. The Depression's elongated out until World War II began. That's what stopped the Depression. But in the meantime, Roosevelt layered in what we have today, and that's safety nets, so you don't starve to death, all right? And he did that. And it was the first time in American history was, before that was, you're on your own. He created that apparatus, and he created a lot of federal projects to give people work.
How much of FDR's ability to lead us through the Depression comes from his silver spoon upbringing?
You know, he lived a life of comfort, but he had polio. So it wasn't...
Which he hid.
Yeah, and the press allowed it. He, FDR, governed the way benevolent dictators govern. Okay, he had some empathy for those people, but he didn't want to associate with them. He was more emotionally involved with his stamp collection than he was with actual, folks.
But FDR's White House residence was far from lavish. O'Reilly writes FDR sleeps alone, his bedroom simply decorated with an iron frame cot, a chest of drawers, and a single chair. The Spartan furnishings befitting a leader in time of depression and war. FDR, you would say, was the first maybe modern president who was also a military chief. So was FDR a great commander-in-chief?
I'd say he was a good commander-in-chief because he won. But FDR could have stopped a lot of the Holocaust and didn't, because his war council didn't want to divert Allied planes to bomb the tracks leading to
Auschwitz and Birkenau and everything else.
So he listened to them. Look, all men are flawed, but FDR is on a top 5 list because he was victorious.
FDR ran for president and won a record 4 times. In 1944, he chose a Kansas City hat maker as his running mate.
So they needed Truman on the ticket because the prior vice president had been too liberal. And the country after World War II changed to a more conservative nation. Roosevelt maybe talked to him 5 times. They had no relationship whatsoever. For Roosevelt thought he was, some bumpkin.
FDR, 4 terms. Was there a, arrogance complex, savior complex, messianic complex?
He just liked the job.
Didn't have anything else to do?
Yeah, I mean, if he stepped down, he'd have to hang out with Eleanor. He didn't want to do that.
Okay. So we come out swinging with FDR. Jen, what are your thoughts? I'm taking notes as I'm watching this, but so if you're wondering why I keep looking down that way, I'm taking notes.
No. I enjoy listening to Bill O'Reilly's reasoning for this. FDR he's understandable because we love these presidents who get us through conflict, right? Mm-hmm. And he's a president who got us through the biggest war this country has ever seen, right? And we mobilized. America did get through the Depression because all of a sudden we were making things like we had never made before. Mm-hmm. People went to work that didn't go to work before, and the country came together. And so, yeah, it really did pop us out of that depression. And he did put a lot of good policies into place because what the Depression had done to America and left them kind of stranded with nothing. And so welfare, things along that nature all got started because of FDR. And of course, his wife was so instrumental in all of that as well. Mm-hmm. I think the problem with FDR is you forget about the Chinese internment camps, right? You think about him taking Americans and taking their rights away and putting them in camps. Like, Chinese Americans don't think of FDR as one of the greatest presidents of all time. Like, he put them, he took everything they had and put them away in these places. Like, I'm actually going to cover one here soon in Walk with History. Like, it's just one of those things, like, he comes out victorious because of what happened in World War II, but the way he handled World War II, the way we got into World War II wasn't great as a president, right? I do love the fireside chats. I do think those helped reassure the country. I appreciate that. I don't like the way the reporter said who couldn't walk. FDR could walk. He had a hard time, but
I don't think he got polio until later in life.
He didn't. And he could walk with his braces on,
Right.
and the canes, but he had no use of his legs. That was what was the problem. And like Bill O'Reilly said, the press was very respectful about not photographing him in a vulnerable state, so he didn't seem like he wasn't powerful to lead the nation. Something that wouldn't be done today. And yeah, and he said he doesn't care about the affairs. The FDR was known for that, and he talks about how he has a simple bedroom at the White House. But let's not forget Hyde Park and
I,
how
I was
you
gonna say,
cameras.
well, okay, so my thoughts, I think Bill O'Reilly is backhanding FDR a couple of times in his reasoning as to why he put FDR on here. It's kind of like, I like FDR, I'm gonna put FDR on here, but I'm gonna call him a dictator.
Yeah, that's
I'm going to say he didn't stop the Holocaust. He didn't allocate planes to bomb tracks. Okay. It was a little more involved than that.
plus.
FDR knew about the
Mhm.
Holocaust
Yeah.
before we went to World War II. He knew about it happening before Pearl Harbor. And he even went so far as to deny Jewish immigration from Europe, knowing that this was happening. So that's a huge, for me, that's a huge strike against FDR. I am kind of surprised that Bill didn't mention the Japanese internment camps, but did mention the court packing, which was not popular. The court packing thing was not popular in FDR's day. The internment camps were. So I could understand that because that was a very populist move. I mean, we're talking about a different era here, guys.
Yeah.
I asked my grandmother, who's 90 years old, I asked her a few years ago, she was 8, I believe, around that age when Pearl Harbor happened. And I asked her about the Japanese internment camps, and she said that everyone wanted them. It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't talked about. It just was what it was, and people felt safer with it happening. So at the time, it was a very popular move by FDR. The other thing I don't think that he talks about, which I am kind of surprised because Bill O'Reilly is conservative, and the sweeping welfare programs that FDR ushers in, yes, the Great Depression ends with the war effort, with the Lend-Lease and all of that employment. And my great grandmother was a Rosie, so she was able to get employment as a single mother. So I think that those were great things and moved the social, moved women up as far as, ushering in a women's, feminist movement and women rights. However, like I said, Bill is kind of reluctantly putting FDR in this position. He's not like super sold on him. And I get where it's like, well, FDR, he won World War II for us. You could easily switch out FDR with Truman or Eisenhower and say the same thing. And I think that their presidencies were less contentious as far as I'm concerned. But that's just my thoughts on FDR. I personally don't rate FDR. I don't lord him at the top personally myself. I think there's a lot of problematic things that FDR did that I can't ignore. But that's my thought. Any last thoughts on FDR before we move on to the next guy?
No, I agree with you. I kind of would think Eisenhower would be the better pick here, in my opinion. And like you said, if you really want someone who like ended the war, it would be more Truman. But yeah, I think he's a softball because of World War II.
I agree. I think this was a very safe pick for Bill O'Reilly because I think there's a lot of historians that would put FDR there. But yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep moving on this train.
Cousin and the inspiration for the teddy bear, the original Rough Rider, Theodore Roosevelt, comes in as number 4 on Bill O'Reilly's ranking of greatest presidents. In 1901, after fewer than 200 days as vice president, Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency following William McKinley's assassination. His term in office was defined by bold leadership and visionary reform.
Why does Teddy, who doesn't like Teddy, likes Theodore, why does Theodore rank above Franklin?
He liked Colonel best. If you want to get in good with President.
Not Mr. President, it was
Colonel. Loved it. So Teddy Roosevelt is a guy who's raised in a very wealthy family, goes to Harvard, sickly guy, all right? A lot of maladies as a kid, doesn't have good eyesight, and he's angry about it. So he becomes a great boxer, an outdoorsman, a sportsman, embraces the robust life. Why Teddy Roosevelt makes the list, in my opinion, is that he brought an unbelievable amount of good feeling to the presidency because he was larger than life, no BS, no spin zone.
I was about to say the no
Right.
spin zone.
He's the original no spin guy, Teddy.
You two would have gotten along.
I think we would have seen the world the same way. I don't know whether we gotten along or not.
First modern president who spanned the 19th, 20th century, but also a family man. Father, kids in the White House, pets in the White House.
That's the nicest picture of the Roosevelt family you will ever see. And his kids adored him.
Still in his boots.
Yeah, he always wore his boots. And his kids adored him, but he had trouble with the oldest one.
Alice.
Alice was smoking and smuggling boys into the White House and drove Teddy crazy. Teddy rose the morale of America to the highest level. Because remember, he's coming off McKinley, coming off Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, all these guys are, all right, yeah, they're there. Then Teddy comes a superstar. Okay, he's the Taylor Swift of masculine men. Wherever he went, the crowds loved him. The morale.
The Taylor Swift of masculine men.
Right. Highest energy president by far, Teddy Roosevelt. All right, he was the original environmentalist, conservation all over the place, and he's fair. He's a fair guy, all right? Not venal, austere in his social life. But he had a vision of the country. And the vision is that we should be robust, that we're the best country.
Donald Trump would love to be Teddy Roosevelt, wouldn't he?
I don't know about that, because it's a whole different thing. Trump likes the business world. He feels comfortable in the business world. He's a deal maker. Teddy wasn't a deal maker. Teddy would say, this is where it's going to be. If it's not, I'm going to kick your butt.
And you'd love to have dinner with him, wouldn't you?
Teddy would have been great, as long as he bought, because he ate a lot.
Coming up, the biggest surprise on the entire count.
Teddy Roosevelt. All right, Jen, what's your thoughts on Teddy?
You know, I like this one. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, had his faults, but I covered that McKinley assassination, and I take that walk from where McKinley died to where Roosevelt walks to his friend's house to take the oath of office, knowing that he's about to be president. He's the youngest president ever, and he had to leave his kids, and he had to leave his family behind to make that trip to get there in time. McKinley had passed that night, and he gets there that morning to take that oath of office. I love to talk about Alice.
I love Alice.
Alice is my favorite. That girl was fire. And even he didn't know how to handle her sometimes. Theodore Roosevelt, the issues I have with him is, he is part of the Rough Riders. He makes that march to San Quentin Hill. But there were men who did it before him, and they were men of color. And so he never gives them their credit. He says he was the first. I always had an issue with that. But when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, one of the first meetings he has in the White House is Booker T. Washington. He writes him. He asks to come for a meeting in the White House. So he does reach out across race to have reconciliation. So I do appreciate that about him. I do love the conservationist and the land and the national parks. I love that about Teddy Roosevelt. He's an 8-year president. I love that he took a bullet while he was speaking and kept talking. Like, I love those things about him. I do like him up there because I think he was a good leader. I think he did move the country forward. I think he was something we as character we could look up to. He did have children in the White House. He did raise them in the White House. And he did try to control Alice. He did try to mentor her even through her. I think of her, like, remember when the Bush daughters were in the White House and they were like always sticking out their tongue at the press? Like, she's worse, right? She's worse.
Yes. I love that Alice had like a pet snake that she would stick on like reporters and stuff. And I also like that Teddy Roosevelt, you want to talk about someone that hated reporters. Teddy Roosevelt hated reporters, and he boxed with them. He set up a boxing ring on the White House lawn and boxed reporters. Actually made one guy lose hearing in one of his ears. Like, and he was a prize winning boxer. TR was like, he had that dog in him. I can't say enough good things about TR. You know, he was he won a Medal of Honor, you know, and I think his as far as race, I think one of the biggest failures that you could criticize TR on would probably be the Brownsville affair, or the Brownsville affair. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
You know, which led to a dishonorable discharge of over 100 African American soldiers. And there was a lot of controversy over that, whether that was a good decision or not, or whether the decision was warranted. One thing I wish he would have mentioned was the Great White Fleet, because I think that's one of TR's better accomplishments. I just love that story. You know, of course, we know him for his conservation efforts. We know him for the Panama Canal. You know, we know him for the his trust busting initiatives, the Square Deal, and all of that. But he really, I think, pushed America into the international stage, pushed us onto the international stage in a really big way with the Great White Fleet. My only criticism of Teddy Roosevelt was, because of Teddy Roosevelt, we got landed with Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
That's what I don't like about Teddy Roosevelt. He split the party when he started his own party, the Bull Moose Party, and that's kind of what landed us with Woodrow Wilson. And I would probably rate Woodrow Wilson down on the bottom of my list, because I just think he was kind of a vile person. You know,
Yeah.
you want to talk about corruption in the White House. Let me just say this. You want to talk about a media that didn't report on things like FDR not being able to walk. Wilson literally had a stroke in the White House, and everyone hid it
That's
for
right.
months.
For a while.
And his wife was the one that was actually running the country for, you know, but granted, it was his last term and he was leaving, but they hid that from the public, and the media was totally complicit in that. Yeah, but that's all I have to say. Good pick. I think Theodore Roosevelt, I would rate him pretty high on my own list. So I would agree with O'Reilly on this pick. All right, let's move on. Let's see what this next guy is going to be.
Down. Number 3, all-time great. Kennedy, Reagan, think again. Bill O'Reilly's third greatest president of all time isn't even a household name.
James K. Polk, a president on your best presidents list, probably that America knows the least about.
They don't know anything about it.
Polk became governor of Tennessee, then served only one term as president in the 1840s. But in that term, he doubled the size of the country by winning the Mexican-American War.
This Polk, he's got a nice little haircut there. It's a little effeminate, but that's all right. He'd do well in the Democratic Party today.
Sign of the times. Wearing a tuxedo evening jacket.
I think this is velvet. He's got a little velvet jacket on, a little choker around the neck. I mean, that was the high fashion back then. And all I can say is I'm glad I didn't live in the 1840s. Polk was a very sickly child. He had to have all these operations, which ruined his health forever. And he's the governor of Tennessee. He's boring. And he gets elected because there really wasn't a lot of competition, and Andrew Jackson liked him. So Polk comes in, he immediately tells the American people, I'm only serving 4 years. That's it. One term, don't worry about me. He did that because he knew he was going to die. Polk knew. So he gets in, and he's looking at the map, and he's going, you know what? We should be from Washington to Portland, Oregon. We should be
Sea to shining sea.
all of this should be ours. Okay, well, what is this stuff with Mexico? What is this stuff going on? We're going to take it all. Now, Mexico, one of the most corrupt countries on the planet to this day. But back then, it was even more corrupt. So Polk goes, you know, these guys, they're obnoxious. So they kind of engineer the Mexican-American War. Kick the Mexicans all over the place, take everything. California, everything comes to us. So he consolidates the entire country. And then he doesn't screw it up. He makes the list because he had vision, right? He saw it, and he made it happen. That's hard.
Polk was also a workaholic. In the book, O'Reilly writes James K. Polk has no hobbies, avocations, or interests beyond politics. Even his enemies marvel at the intensity of his nonstop work habits.
He was working like Obama. Obama was the hardest working modern president. And that's why I didn't like Biden. Obama didn't like Biden because Biden was like taking a nap every 3 hours as vice president. So Polk was just, he never left. He worked himself to death.
Fair to say Polk's been forgotten by history?
Yeah, nobody knows James Polk.
Is that because there was something not about him?
He's boring.
Because he didn't have an ego? He didn't need it?
Never.
He didn't aggrandize himself?
He didn't demonstrate any ego. And he was just a guy who luckily got elected and then expanded the nation to what we have today.
If James K. Polk simply brought us more land and Kennedy saved us from nuclear war and sent a man to the moon, how does Kennedy not qualify?
Kennedy had some very, very good achievements. The reason he didn't make the list was that he screwed up a lot. And it was kept from the American people.
Most overhyped president?
JFK, by far. JFK comes in, oh, it's Camelot. John Kennedy was a good president for the short time he was there, but he wasn't an activist president. Polk was an activist.
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about James K. Polk.
I find it so interesting because a lot of my master's research brought me deep into the Mississippi Delta, right? And as I was at this little archive in Coffeyville, Mississippi, I was looking through their paperwork and I found all these signatures from James K. Polk because James K. Polk owned a plantation in Coffeyville, Mississippi throughout his entire presidency where he kept his enslaved. And I saw his signature on so many things and I kept saying, this is the president's signature. This is the president's signature. Doesn't anybody care? And obviously not. So that shows you how much people know about James K. Polk. You know, the problem with Polk, I like what they said, like no one knows about him. I think he treated the presidency like a business and he was running a business. Yeah. Did he expand? Did he get Texas? I'm sure Texans love Polk. Did he get Oregon? He did. And did he get New Mexico? Yeah. The Mexican-American War, he won. He got new territory. But he's saying that Kennedy had all these faults. Polk is setting us up for civil war. Polk is a slave owner. He's not thinking about this new territory that we're gaining for America. He's not saying whether this is slave states or free states. He's like, this is a huge economic battle in America. And he's like, here goes in more land and good luck with that. Figure it out for yourselves. You know, so yeah, does he accomplish what he sets out to accomplish in his presidency? He does. He does what he promised. He's only president for 4 years. He is sickly, right? But I see him as a placeholder. I see him as doing what a president should do, running the business, signing the paperwork, dotting the I's, but not moving the needle one way or the other. And in fact, he's actually setting us up for bigger problems down the line because he's getting the land. He's not designating any of the land. He's not policing any of this land. He's not making it. We got it and someone else can deal with it.
Right. I agree with you on that part. For me, you know, if you have not watched Bill O'Reilly's Worst, go back and watch his Worst because what I'm about to say might not make sense to you if you haven't. Polk being on this list, especially being third on this list, to me just totally destroys any credibility Bill O'Reilly has as a historian because you cannot have Pierce and Tyler as your fifth and fourth worst presidents and then put James K. Polk as your third because Polk was the guy in the middle of those two horrible presidents. Okay? You have Tyler, who was the one that annexed Texas, which Polk ran on. He wanted to do it. That was on his list. Tyler got it done before he left office. Polk comes in. He tries to buy the land from Mexico. He offers them $2 million. When that doesn't work, then he does orchestrate the war, the Mexican-American War, which was controversial at the time, but it was a huge deal. And it was something that the Democrats wanted. And they wanted it in the name of Manifest Destiny, but they also wanted it so that they could expand banned slavery in the United States. That
Mhm.
was the two biggest reasons that the Democrats wanted it done. James K. Polk, like John Tyler, who Bill O'Reilly excoriated for being the biggest racist we've ever had as president, which I think is highly debatable.
Yeah.
James K. Polk not only owned slaves, but he bought 13 children from the slave market in Washington, D.C. while he was president and brought them into the White House to serve him. He is the only president that did that. So you cannot go, John Tyler was this huge racist and he's on the worst because he loved slavery, when it's pretty obvious that James K. Polk had the same attitude towards slavery as Tyler did. In fact, Polk, if he does, because you have to remember, Polk literally dies like
Mhm.
right after he leaves the White House.
Yeah.
If he did not die, he
Yeah.
would have joined the Confederacy along with Tyler. And so
Yeah.
that's why I am so confused as to why Bill O'Reilly has him on here. Yes, did he get everything he wanted to done in one term? He absolutely did. And the only reason why he did that was because of his wife, Sarah Polk. Sarah Polk, they didn't have any children. She was your first Hillary Clinton. She was your first Michelle Obama. She was just as much a part of James K. Polk's success as any other first lady. She, in fact, wrote a lot of the letters and a lot of his speeches that he gave as president. And she kept her slaves in
Mhm.
Tennessee until they forced her to free them with
Mhm.
the Emancipation Proclamation. And she kept their plantation in Tennessee as neutral ground for both
Yeah.
the Union and the South and the Confederacy. As far as the Mexican American War and doubling the country's territory, I think if you're going to have a slave owner on here that did that and did it better without having to go to a war, Thomas
Jefferson.
Jefferson should have been in that spot. You know, Thomas Jefferson doubled the country. We didn't have to go to a war and lose a bunch of people in order to do it. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. I am so dumbfounded as to why he thought, well, I'm going to put Polk there, a no-name president who, quite frankly, you know, I could understand it if he chose two other people on his worst list other than Pierce and Tyler, but for me, Pierce, Tyler, Polk, they're one and the same. They did the exact same stuff. They buried their head in the sand. They exacerbated the slavery issue in the country and put us on a trajectory towards civil war. So for me, I have a huge issue with Polk being on this list.
I totally agree with you. And when we
Let's see,
talk
do I have anything else? Okay, and I think that's all I wrote down.
No,
Like,
I totally agree. And when we talk about Jefferson, see the problem that I'm seeing here, because I pretty much know who one is, right? Because it never really changes, is we're
Yeah.
not talking about the men who wrote the doctrine that became America, right? Like we're leaving out Madison and Jefferson from all of this, right? Both slaveholders, right?
mhm,
But both of them still wrote documents we use today.
Yeah.
Both of them still wrote documents that still define our country today. So much so that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is still cited every time the Supreme Court gives rights to new groups of people in America. They cite the Declaration of Independence because it is such a great catch-all. And he wrote this, right? We always talk about this, Lisa, you and I. He's the American paradox, right? But he
You're
wrote
talking
it.
about Jefferson. Yes.
Jefferson, yeah, which he's not on this list at all. Which I'm just like, that's why I don't know, Bill O'Reilly. I don't know where you're.
Yeah. Also, I don't like the way that he characterized John F. Kennedy
I
as
don't either.
being like, I thought that was kind of snarky and like kind of out of left field
It seems like
because
he was jealous of Kennedy. It sounded a little more personal than treating,
yeah,
right? I
like
was like,
like have
hmm?
you met Kennedy? I mean, I know he's, you know, older. Have you met John F. Kennedy? Like, what did he do? Spit in your face? Like, I just don't understand the Kennedy hate there. Like, that was
Yeah,
so random to me.
I like Kennedy as a president. So yeah, that was interesting.
He wasn't in for a long time, and you know, I think what he did as far as like ushering in the Camelot to the United States, and he gave a fresh and young attitude, the aura he gave out, I think he should be celebrated more. And that was super kind of bitchy of Bill O'Reilly to
It
say
was.
something like
I'll tell you, Lisa, when I hear Kennedy's Race to the Moon speech, I cry.
that.
When he's
Wonderful.
we're
Yeah.
gonna get to the moon. Like he inspires me.
Yeah. All right. Okay, let's move on.
Polk expanded the footprint of our nation, but George Washington made the American idea possible. A hero of the Revolutionary War, Washington's presidency laid the cornerstone for a new nation, and he stepped down after 2 terms, cementing his legacy as a man who put country before self.
When doing your no-spin assessment of George Washington, how do you deal with the legend that he has become over 275 years?
I didn't deal with it. I don't care about the cherry tree or any of this stuff that's floating around. So Washington, I love him. How lucky are we as a country to have this guy? Number one, he should have lost the Revolutionary War because it was ridiculous, the most powerful army on earth and Navy, and Washington wins. Washington was really a courageous man. So here he's at Valley Forge, which is horrendous. So he writes to his spy. He says, come back and report to me. And then he signs, and that's the very famous George Washington signature. And then he's coronated. There was no election. You're president. And George says, okay, I'll be president. And he says, all right, we're going to organize the country into the states, but the federal government is going to call the shots. We're running the show, right? Because he knew there were a lot of loons in Georgia. Now, don't get mad at me if you live in Georgia, but the King of England sent all the convicts and mental people to Georgia, okay, on boats. So there were a lot of loons down there.
And to be fair, Georgia then was a little different than Georgia now.
Yeah, of course, Leland, thank you for pointing that out. Anyway, Washington knew that. So he said, we're going to have a strong federal government. And then if you look at the 8 years, it was an incredible growth process, almost all positive. But he laid the foundation for what we have today in a very effective way.
You studied him, you loved him.
Oh, he's the greatest guy.
What would he think of America now?
You know, he'd be bored by it. He wouldn't watch cable TV. He wouldn't go on social media. He'd be bored by it.
I was going to say, what bathrooms people go in would probably not be on George Washington's list of big problems.
But this extraordinary man faced ordinary problems.
So Washington and his mother didn't like the children at all. The mother didn't think George was giving her enough money. And so she wrote letters to the newspaper saying, my son is starving me.
Wait, so she didn't write letters to her son, she wrote letters to the newspaper.
To the newspapers. My son George is starving me. Drove him nuts. Washington didn't go to her funeral. Did not go to his own mother's funeral. This is unbelievable. And nobody watching today was taught this in school.
All right, so when we come back, Bill O'Reilly's greatest president, and will we ever see another one?
Okay.
That's funny.
Go ahead, Jen. I have a lot of things I want to say, but go ahead.
So again, Lisa, you're doing your master's. When I was researching my master's, I wrote this kind of a paper about the mothers of our founding fathers, right? Because who taught these men to be such forward-thinking men? George Washington quote, the single most influential person in my life has been my mother. Mm-hmm. Quote. That's now granted, yeah, she was a survivalist, right? She's widowed early, right? And even George's second marriage, like she's trying to provide for her son. She's trying to get her son out there, which is what you do as a woman in the 1700s. And yeah, I think she felt like more was due to her. I get that. But George Washington, to me, yeah, he's a flawed man, but we have our country because of him. And he was an enslaver. He was. And he made his fortune off of that. But he also could have been so bad. People called him Your Excellency. People called him king. He wouldn't let people say that to him. He's the one who steps down after 2 terms. He could have went so much further with what he had, what he built, than what he did. And it's not to say George Washington wasn't egotistical. He was. Thank God he was to a certain extent. He did lead. He did do some crazy things in war, but it inspired people to follow him. I do think he is the father of our nation. I do think he did some amazing things and started our country. Doesn't mean I think he was perfect. I don't think he was perfect, but I do think he should be on this list because what he did set the tone for what would be America. And
Yeah.
I do appreciate him for that.
I agree. I do think he should be on this list. There is clearly a reason why George Washington is called the GOAT. He is the father of our country. My issue is with Bill O'Reilly and the things that he said, and some of the things that he characterized of George Washington, I think are not true. Also, Georgia, by the way, I'm going to come to your defense because I've studied the state of Georgia. Oglethorpe is a hero of mine.
Mhm.
So for him to say that Georgia was a prison colony, it absolutely freaking was not. Oglethorpe, he envisioned a utopia for Georgia, and part of that was to have debtors come and get them out of debtors prison, which was a horrible place, very horrible living conditions, especially in England at the time, and try and establish a haven for them to work off their debt and then settle the land and get a piece of their own. So Georgia, I'm sorry Bill O'Reilly hates you guys so much. I don't know why he said that because that was so not true. Georgia was never a prison colony. I don't know where he got the that George III sent mental patients to Georgia. That was so out of left field. So I'm going to defend Georgia on that. I am not from Georgia, but I know the history of Georgia. I've done a few videos on it. I've researched the Moravians in Georgia. I just think that was so weird. George Whitfield in Georgia, just random. So random. I don't know why he said that, and I don't know why he disparaged Georgia in that way. The other problem I have with Bill O'Reilly is he basically makes it sound like George Washington created the United States Constitution and like set up the state system, which we had in place under the Articles of Confederation. So I don't know why he said that Washington established the states. That was well established before Washington took office. Yes, Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, but I think if you're going to give credit to someone who established our constitutional government, that would be Madison, not George Washington. George Washington, to me, does get credit, though, for establishing key elements of the executive office that every president since him has followed suit. The cabinet, for one, that was a huge deal for George Washington. So for me, that's kind of that's where I would put George Washington. I mean, he setting all of these presidents to be the guy to set the example and set the tone of what the presidency should be and should look like. Washington will always get the credit for that. Yes, his views on slavery are complex. It is a very George Washington, he frees his slaves upon his death, and then his wife will free them before she dies. They were supposed to be freed at the death of Martha, and Martha frees them right after George Washington's death. Yeah, his relationship with Mary Ball is a humorous one to me in that he had mommy issues, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. So it gives him a human element. Now, I have taken on this goal to read a biography of every American president, and the first one I read was Ron Turnhouse. Incredibly extensive and very detailed book on George Washington. I think Bill O'Reilly should read it. I'm sure his co-author has. If he hasn't, I highly recommend you read it, Bill. So that's my issue. I don't have an issue with Washington being on this list. I have an issue with some of the things that Bill O'Reilly said. The other thing is when it comes to George Washington and his role as commander of the Continental Army, Washington, my greatest admiration when it comes to Washington is standing on principle when times were tough. I mean, they tried to assassinate him. There was several coups against him to get him out of his position as general, and his ability to create an inner circle as strong as he did and to mentor the right people was the best thing about George Washington. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, Nathaniel Greene, all these guys
Yeah.
owe all of their success to the mentorship of George Washington. And I think that is the mark of a great leader who can mold people and inspire people. And that's my favorite thing about George Washington.
No,
His farewell to his officers is it that makes me emotional when you read that, or when he's coming to them and telling them there's mutiny out in Pennsylvania. He's got all these things that he's dealing with, and to take that time and address his officers and give his men accolades. I just love that about Washington. Washington in the American Revolution is my favorite George Washington. And I think that really sets him up to be such a great president. So that's all I've got to say about Washington. And I think we can all see who's going to be the next Bill O'Reilly's top guy. But let's go on and move on to this.
Before we reveal Bill O'Reilly's pick for the greatest president of all time, it's time for the lightning round.
Easy questions, quick answers. Of all the presidents, who would you most like to have dinner with?
Probably Harry Truman, because he despised the press so much.
I hated this.
Hated us. And that would be a fun dinner.
I wanted to ask you that question. What president would you want to have dinner with, Jenn?
Oh, geez. Honestly, gosh, it's a toss-up. It's really a toss-up between Washington for me and gosh, I had it on the tip of my tongue. And probably JFK. Between those two men. I'm not really interested in their the despise of the press. I'm more interested in what was motivating for them.
Yeah.
What did they look to? What inspired them? I'd like to hear more about what did they find in life that kept them on looking up and wanting better. That's kind of, I look to both of those men. They had such inspiring quotes, and they were so downtrodden at certain times, and they could inspire nations with just words. I want to know more about what inspired them.
Yeah. For me, it's Garfield for sure.
You love Garfield.
Yeah. Everyone's going to be like, who the heck is that? I love James Garfield. He's my favorite president. One of the reasons why I think he's my favorite president is because he died before he could accomplish hardly anything. But I think the platform that he ran on and his story on how he became president, he really has a Cinderella moment. And I just love that. This was a guy that didn't want to be president and ended up being president. And I just want to pick his brain. And he was the smartest guy we've ever had in the office. I mean, he spoke 3 languages. He was a mathematician. He just seemed like such an interesting guy. He was a hero of the Civil War, a congressman from Ohio. And another thing is he sat on the committee because Rutherford B. Hayes, the way that he was elected was very contentious. There was issues with the electors, and so a lot of people believe he stole the election because it was a very close race, and people believed he stole the election, and it literally came down to Congress to decide who was going to be the president. And Garfield was chosen to head up the committee that was going to make that decision. It was like a trial.
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated with Garfield's political career. So that's the only guy I probably would want to sit and have a meal with, because I have so many questions.
That's so awesome. You need to work at the Garfield house.
I know. I need to go visit the Garfield house. Everyone says that. And it's no secret, if you followed me for a long time, my love for Garfield.
Yeah.
Even though he did have an affair, he was one of those guys, had one affair and profusely. I'm also fascinated with that too, because he rebuilt his relationship with his wife, Lucretia.
Yeah.
In such a really beautiful way. Like their letters are really beautiful. And I think and so I'm really interested in that. I don't know. Garfield's just a great guy. Anyway,
she sees all of his papers, considered the first presidential library. She sees all of his papers. So if you ever visit there, consider it our first presidential library.
All right. I'm look forward to it. Maybe one day we'll see. Okay, let's see what else he has to say.
Pointing thing you learned.
Corruption. says selling the offices.
Is that everybody?
Not everybody,
But most.
a lot of them. Making backroom deals, hiring your relatives who stole money, that kind of stuff.
Of all the things in the book, what are you most proud of as a nugget that you ferret out?
That Abraham Lincoln almost committed suicide when his girlfriend, then soon-to-be wife, said, "We're through, we're over." He was pondering it. His friends were worried about him.
He was distraught. Abraham Lincoln didn't take his own life.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt here because Abraham Lincoln was suicidal. He was a manic depressive, okay?
His whole life.
His whole life. He didn't try to commit suicide because of Mary Todd. His whole life he was suicide. He had bouts of deep depression, and he even wrote a poem called a suicidal soliloquy before he meets Mary Todd.
I believe it.
And
Because-
I will just say, I am a Mary Todd apologist.
Mhm.
I think she doesn't get enough credit. I think she's one of the most tragic figures in American history. This woman was dragged through the dirt, through the press, through the elitists in Washington, D.C. They thought she was a Confederate spy, and for good reason. I mean, both of her brothers fought for the Confederacy, and her dad sided with the Confederacy. But she loses both of her brothers during the war. She loses another child during the war. And then she witnesses the horrific assassination of her husband. No, Abraham Lincoln was in love with Mary Todd. He was upset when she broke up with him because, she was also being courted by Stephen Douglas, which I think is really ironic. But yeah, he didn't try to commit suicide because she broke up with him. He was always a little manic and depressive.
Yep.
But I just had to enter that in there because I really feel for Mary Todd, and I feel like she always, even now, she gets dragged through the dirt by historians and people that just don't understand what she went through.
She is a tragic figure, and what she had to do to just keep moving forward through everything.
To just keep moving forward. And then she loses her other son like 10 years after. And anyway.
And her son puts her in a state asylum.
I know that her other son puts her in a state asylum.
I can't deal with my grieving mother. I'm just going to put her away.
The poor woman. Oh my gosh, I feel for Mary. Okay, let's get back to it.
His assassin John Wilkes Booth did. But in the years in between, Lincoln earned the #1 spot on our list. Savior of the Union, liberator of the slaves, Abraham Lincoln led the nation through its darkest hour.
I can't tell you how much I admire Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's a guy, comes out of a rural upbringing, no formal education whatsoever, no uncle in the business, doesn't trade favors like all the others did. Basically is lucky to get elected because he makes a speech in New York City that catches the eye of some big-time newspaper people. And he walks in and he goes, I'm going to have to save this country. I'm going to have to save the Union. And I know it's going to be horrible, but I'm going to have to do it. And he did it.
So that makes him the best president.
By far.
By far.
Lincoln did bring a sense of morality into the White House with him. So Lincoln, he was driven to free the slaves, but at the same time, he didn't want to collapse the country. And he managed to do both. Therefore, he's #1, because that was quite an achievement.
One of my favorite things to do in Washington is go for an early morning run. You end up at the Lincoln Memorial, and you see the Gettysburg Address, and you see words of his second inaugural, the two famous speeches. What in his personality helped him understand what the nation needed at those moments?
Well, Lincoln's philosophy was shaped by the Bible. He wasn't a theocrat or a particularly religious person. I don't think he even went to church. But he read the Bible, and he took out of that all men are created equal. Lincoln was relentless in his belief that he was doing the right thing. And that's why he's the best president. The hatred toward Lincoln was far more than any other president ever, okay? and he endured it.
This is 1864.
Yeah, Lincoln is running for re-election, and McClellan is running on the Democratic ticket. Lincoln had fired General McClellan because he was a terrible general. So he got into politics, and McClellan, as you can see in this poster, is a racist.
You will defeat Negro equality, restore prosperity, reestablish the Union in an honorable, permanent, and happy peace.
And if you vote for Lincoln, you will bring on Negro equality, more debt, harder times, another draft.
Universal anarchy and ultimate ruin.
Arrest Trump now!
Trump says, I'm the most vilified president. Lincoln was far more vilified because of the slavery issue. He was one persistent SOB. You couldn't derail this guy. He gets knocked down, he gets back up.
There's no arguing with Lincoln as the best. What I find problematic with Lincoln is he becomes
A
untouchable.
little tyrannical. No.
Yeah. The thing is, like, he doesn't start out with abolishing slavery. It grows into this whole process. And then he knows in order to seal the deal, he has to get the amendments passed. But it grows into this. He realizes this is what it's going to take to win and to bring the country back together. It's not how he starts. It's a process. Same thing with the process of winning the war. Lincoln wins the war because he puts people in place that fight. And McClellan is one of those who don't. And
But he didn't. But Lincoln doesn't do that for the first half of the war.
It takes so long. Exactly.
It took him a long time.
A long time. And again, this is the thing, this gradual building of this man is, we think of him at the end and we put him at that person, but that's not who Lincoln was at the beginning of his presidency.
Right.
And so he's learning all of that. And I think that's what makes him a great president is he learns these lessons, he learns them quickly, and he takes them to heart. When it comes to morality and character, absolutely. Abraham Lincoln, I think, is our only president I don't think ever had an affair.
I don't know. There are some people that are trying to paint him out as, gay. I don't know if you saw that. There's a new documentary coming out talking about him and a relationship he had with a friend of his.
Oh my gosh. Well, I know he picked very good people, his Secretary of War, his Secretary of State. Like, he picks great people to have around him. And VP, not so much, but like, he's picking, when he finally decides on Grant to run the Union, like he does learn his lessons and he picks good men who will do the job and the job that he wants done and have good moral character themselves. So I don't know. I like Lincoln because he's learned those lessons and learned them quickly. My problem with Lincoln is, like, he becomes almost godlike now. And you're kind of like, no, the man was flawed. He did make mistakes. He did make mistakes in the beginning of his presidency. I always have to remind people the Emancipation Proclamation only talks about 5 areas in it.
Yeah.
They're only emancipating slaves in 5 areas, and it's not even areas that the Union controls. So
yeah, when it comes to Lincoln, you're right. I think he is in this mythos of Newt Gingrich. You can think of him whatever you want as a politician, but he's a historian and he's written a lot of things about history. And he had done a series called Immortals. And these are people who are just untouchable when it comes to history. No matter what you try to do to cancel them, they will always be in the sphere. Washington is one of them. I would think Lincoln's another. Even after America's long gone, people will still know of Washington. People will still know, just like they'll know of Napoleon, just like they'll know of, some of these immortal characters in history, right? And I think Lincoln kind of has become that, especially in the American mind. Some of the greatest things he did, the Emancipation Proclamation, he got there. It took a lot of convincing. It took a lot of work from Frederick Douglass to get him there because of Abraham Lincoln's fear that he had run on we're going to keep the Union together, and he had painted this war out. It's not a war about slavery, it's about keeping the Union together. And then coming out with the Emancipation Proclamation made a lot of people mad. A lot of people mad that were Copperhead Democrats that were fighting this war because they wanted to keep the Union together. He ultimately preserves the Union. He
Mhm.
gives us one of the greatest speeches of all time, the Gettysburg Address, which is a masterclass in oration. So
Yeah.
great. Um,
260 minutes. He doesn't need to talk forever.
right. And but there are some things that he did do.
Mhm.
He suspended habeas corpus in Maryland. He did throw a sitting congressman in jail. He, drove newspapers that spoke badly about the war out of business.
Mhm.
So, there are some things that rightfully so, I think people are critical of Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln gave one of my favorite speeches, and I think that was the speech that Bill O'Reilly was alluding to when some guy saw his speech in New York. The speech I'm pretty sure he's referring to is the Lyceum Address, which is just a beautiful, eloquent speech, and it's just one of my favorite speeches ever. I've done a few posts on it. I mean, it comes about at a time when things are getting super volatile in the country. And Abraham Lincoln is starting his political career. I believe he is like running for Congress
Mhm.
for the first time. And he gives this speech after a abolitionist newspaper gets ransacked by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois, and this speech is just absolutely beautiful, and it emphasizes the United States Constitution, and just the adherence to the rule of law, and that there are issues in our political institutions, and it's just it's one of my favorites. If you've never read the Lyceum speech, go and read it. I think it's so inspiring, and it shows the skill that
Mhm.
Lincoln had, and there are presidents that have that skill and can just do a master class in this kind of writing and communication and speeches. JFK would be one of them.
Yeah.
I would think Reagan is another. You
Mhm.
could even make a case for Obama
Yeah.
being just a master orator. Um,
Yes.
and those presidents, I think, are always seen in a great light because they can communicate so effectively, even if on the back end there's stuff that you don't like
Sure.
FDR's fireside chats, his ability to speak to the people is
Mhm.
really what people remember him the most about in his leadership style. And I think Lincoln was the same way. When
Absolutely.
his speeches were published in the newspaper, they were inspiring to a nation. George Washington's farewell address.
Yes.
School children used to have to study the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and George Washington's farewell address because it's just that good. And I think Lincoln, FDR, JFK, even Reagan, these guys, they really had it down. They really had it down.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. And I mean, when it comes to Lincoln, it's our country's only civil war, right? It's our country coming back together. I love where in the end, he believed in reconciliation without malice,
Yeah.
right? I think that did so
I
much to heal a country.
I think although I will say I think Lincoln's biggest mistake was choosing Andrew Johnson
Yes.
as vice
Well,
president.
Andrew
And
Johnson messed so much up after the fact. Like, ugh, reconciliation. He messes so much up after the fact.
well, and that's the thing. Andrew Johnson wasn't his original vice president.
Mhm.
He had to make the political move to choose Andrew Johnson, who was a pro Northerner Democrat from Tennessee.
Yep. Yeah, he was.
you know, a Polk, if you will. Just kidding.
Mhm. Yeah.
um, so it was a calculated and political move for him to choose Andrew Johnson. I don't think he thought he was going to die. I mean, he
No.
was the first president that was assassinated in office.
Yes.
So, that came out of left field, and I think, and Andrew Johnson, he got totally kicked out of every meeting.
Mhm.
The cabinet didn't want him, so
And he was scared. He
he
wasn't
was
ready for it.
totally in the dark. I mean, you wanna talk about a guy that the president never talked to. FDR at least spoke to Truman every so often. Abraham Lincoln just wanted Johnson to go back to Tennessee.
Yep.
So let's hear his closing remarks, and then we'll discuss them, because I think they're kind of interesting here.
But the times make the man. And through the Cold War, a financial crisis, and a pandemic, nobody made Bill O'Reilly's top 5 list.
The problems that we have now are not of a historic nature.
So the times make the man. To be great, you must have that moment.
The challenges make the man.
If we were to take from the book how normal men either become great presidents or terrible presidents or caretaker presidents, what are the lessons in the book for either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, you got to put the country, the welfare of the people above your own self-interest. So you're putting the welfare of other people above your own welfare. We don't see that much.
So the modern presidency has become what?
A machine. They're more machine than people. And they do what they're told. Too much money in it. Too much ideology.
Will ever have another great president?
Yeah, I do. I think that someone will come along to reunite the country to a certain extent, because we're too divided now, obviously. But we need a president, and not only that, but leaders on all levels that will say, look, I might lose, but I'm going to do the right thing, and this is why I believe it's the right thing to do.
We end tonight's presidential countdown with the words of a founding father who never became president, though he did make it onto the $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin called America a republic if you can keep it. Remember, the government you elect is the government you deserve. So don't forget to vote. I'm Leland Vittert. I'll see you
Thanks,
next
Leland. Thanks, Leland Virt. Okay. I wrote down a couple things on this closing, on his closing remarks, but I'll let you go first. Do you have any?
He says, like, we haven't lived through historic times. And I'm like, well, what was COVID? Right? Like, I'm like, that was pretty much a historic.
I feel like every year we've had a historic moment. I feel like we haven't caught our breath since 2020.
I feel like I can't wait for kids to study this 100 years from now. Like, there's presidents, there've been a lot that they've had to deal with. And, that's why I think, honestly, Lisa, I think that's why it's so hard to find a candidate who wants to be president, because there is so much a president has to deal with, and so much that they have to policy and all between, the House and the Senate and, the judge. Like, there's just so much. And now the press has become such a monster within itself. Like, anybody who wants to run, it's such a difficult job now. It's more than just running the country.
Can I just say that this about the press, this is nothing new.
Mhm.
The way that the press has acted, I mean, I can think of so many elections, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams comes to mind. Can you imagine? Let me just put it this way. Could you imagine you're Andrew Jackson, you get elected to the president after losing in a very contentious election previously to your rival, John Quincy Adams, who could not be further opposite from you. And then your rival goes, well, I'm going to run for Congress and I'm going to go make your life hell in Congress. Because that's what Quincy does.
Sure.
He was the president. He left office, became congressman for Massachusetts, and literally rallied against everything Andrew Jackson wanted to do.
Yeah. And what do you think of Jefferson too, with Calendar, right? Writing all the stuff about him in the paper. And then Jefferson just kind of just ignores it. And then Calendar ends up dead.
Yeah. Or Alexander Hamilton, who literally starts the New York Post.
Yes.
To just crap all over the Federalists.
No,
or the Democrats.
Yeah, the only difference is, I think, just the speed of which the information
travels. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I could see us moving. I could see us going back to a somewhat plain nice, But when he was talking about machine politics, I wrote down Tammany Hall.
Yeah.
Because that to me was just as corrupt and machine as the DNC and the RNC is now.
100%. And we thought we moved away from that, right? We thought Tammany Hall was so exposed, and we were like, oh, we know all about the machine that ran the country, and was, we're well aware that that'll never happen again. And now it's almost like it's just more, I don't know. I wouldn't even say private because we know about it. It's one of those things that we know about it, but it's so,
It's kind of in plain sight, but it's like, what are
yeah.
you gonna do with it?
Yeah, it's one of those like it is because when we think like I always find, and again, I'm not going to pick a political side here, but we have a president who we say is not ready to run for reelection. He's not mentally ready to run for reelection, yet he's running the country right now.
Mhm.
Right. So I'm always like, wait, where's the disconnect? Is anyone else seeing the disconnect here? Like he can't run for reelection, but he is the guy right now.
I
Like, and
also thought it was ironic, and I think you touched on it a little bit, how Bill O'Reilly said, he was talking about, like, modern presidents,
Mhm.
and then, not putting any of them on his best list. But then
But
he put Joe Biden as the second worst.
yes, but you and I both agreed when we talked about the worst. How can you do that when his presidency isn't even over? Like to
I know,
me,
but then how can you put in your closing statements that, none of these men have been through historical times, but so they're obviously not, none of them are the best, but Joe Biden's not even out of the White House and you're going to put him as number 2?
like I said, he did pick Biden for the worst, one of the worst, which you and I both like. His presidency isn't even over yet. You're rolling the dice. You have no idea what's going to happen these last couple months. The country could take a huge swing and become, I mean, the odds are not in your favor, but it doesn't mean it can't happen. And as a historian, you never count your chickens before they hatch. That's not your job. You're counting old chickens from 100 years ago. You're not even talking about present day stuff.
Yeah.
So I find that you just lose credibility as a historian when you do that. And I
Mhm.
think and then he turns around and says, I can't pick them best because of what historically we have to look back at them, and none of them have lived through historic times yet that we haven't looked back at. And,
I mean, I don't know. I thought 9/11 was pretty damn historic.
yeah, the whole thing. Yeah, 9/11 was historic. I think COVID, like
COVID
that's
was
really
historic.
historic. Like,
But anyway, well, thanks, Jen, for joining me on this.
yeah, I love talking history.
I
I love
know,
talking
right?
to you, Lisa. So this is great.
I know. And I always find the president so incredibly interesting. Like,
Mhm.
he said a couple of times that, that well, he was boring or this president was boring. I don't think any of these presidents are boring. I don't think boring gets you to the White House.
No,
Um, I think that some of them got to the White House in maybe some dubious means that I wouldn't agree with, but
sure.
that doesn't make you boring.
Oh, well, and some weren't there very long, so that could make you a little
Right.
boring. But I, like you said, when I went to the President's Head ruins, right, and I just loved seeing all of their busts in huge, proportions. To me, every man who's been president, we only had what 46 of them. They've all
Yeah.
accomplished something amazing.
45. We've
45.
had 45.
Like they've all led this country, and they all deserve to be, remembered and looked
Mhm.
at, and they are important people. So yeah, I love. I forgot to mention too with Garfield. I think it was Garfield, or maybe it was Teddy Roosevelt. I love those mutton chops, right? I love the president with the mutton chops, like Chester
Are you
Arthur.
talking about Van Buren?
Yeah, no, I think it was. They had an early picture of TR with some mutton chops,
Oh,
but
when he was, like, a boxer and a
yes,
younger kid?
yes.
I've seen that picture, yeah.
It's one of my favorite presidential looks. I think Chester Arthur had the best ones.
Mm.
I'm a mutton chop person. I
Arthur
like
was a bit of a dandy, though.
he was. He spent so
I
much time
mean,
in clothes.
he was a bit of a dandy, and he was part of the Tammany machine,
He
Tammany Hall
was
machine,
kind of,
and
and
that's
then
how he
he
ended up being president, really.
had a lead. Yep, exactly.
Yep.
But this was
Alright,
a
well,
good conversation.
yeah, this was great. Jen, maybe if we do a tier, I'll have to have you come back and we'll have to rank our worst to best presidents, because I think it's really hard to narrow it down to like one guy as the
Yes.
worst and one guy as the best. Although I mean, Buchanan,
I really feel like it's always Lincoln, it's always Buchanan. I feel like if we took those off and be like, okay, now let's mess with what we've got, because it's always going to be those two on
yeah,
each sides, um, unless something catastrophic would happen or amazing. Like those guys are going to always be 1 and 45.
right, right. Like we'll have to come up with the criteria on how to rate them.
Mhm.
I
All
think.
right.
Anyway, we'll talk about that later. But yeah, Jen, thank you so much for coming on here
Absolutely. I
and
love it.
doing this with me. This was so much fun, and I enjoyed our conversation and discussion. And before we go, tell everyone where to find you one more time.
Sure. I'm on the Walk with History YouTube channel and the Talk with History podcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook.
All right. Thank you so much, Jen. And everyone, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel here and give this video a thumbs up. That really helps me out immensely in
Yeah.
the algorithm.
And if you
Um,
didn't like something we said, put it in the comments. We'll read them. We'll respond.
yeah, we can respectfully disagree with people. It's fine.
Mhm.
Respectfully. I feel like you have to put that disclaimer down on the internet. Be respectful, please. Yeah, but let us know in your thoughts. What did you think of this list? Who would you trade out? Who do you think he unjustly left off the list that you think deserves to be in the top 5 for sure? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We will see you in the next video. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.